Dawn on March 3, 1943, over the Bismarck Sea was deceptively calm. Quiet waves lazily rolled over the wreckage that had been drifting in these waters for several days, mute witnesses to the recent massacre. The air, saturated with the smell of salt freshness, carried something else, the acrid, suffocating smell of burning, fuel oil and death. For thousands of Japanese soldiers trapped in cramped transport holds, this day was supposed to be a long-awaited escape from the walls of Leh. Instead, he became the threshold of hell. Their story, the story of one of the most ruthless and effective naval battles of the Second World War, has long remained in the shadow of the more high-profile battles, Midway, Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, perhaps because her final act was too violent to fit into the heroic narrative. Perhaps because it cast a shadow on those who won it. This is a story not only about the triumph of tactics and technology, but also about the moral chasm that opens up when war removes all its limitations. What led to the horizon exploding with fire and steel, followed by a chilling order that left no room for mercy? And why is this story still hidden in the shadows of history? Part 1. Desperate Dash for Empire. By early 1943, the momentum of Japanese expansion in the Pacific had been broken. Guadalcanal, this meat grinder of the jungle, has exhausted the best divisions of the empire, swallowing ships, planes, and, most importantly, irreplaceable human resources. The myth of Japan's invincibility has been dispelled, but the imperial headquarters still believed in the possibility of a turning point. The key to maintaining a foothold in the southwestern Pacific and threatening Australia was New Guinea. Its northern coast, dotted with Japanese garrisons, became the scene of fierce fighting. The Leh fortress, isolated and constantly under attack from the air, was in desperate need of reinforcements. The Japanese command faced a choice: try to lead the troops through 140 miles of impenetrable, swampy jungles, where the soldiers were mowed down by malaria, dysentery, and hunger, or risk and transfer them by sea. The second, seemingly faster and safer way was chosen. The operation was codenamed Tokyo Express, but this time it was not the usual destroyer breakout under cover of night. It was a large-scale amphibious operation. 8 transports loaded with more than 6,900 soldiers of the elite 51st Division, tons of ammunition, fuel, and provisions were supposed to break through from Rabaul to Leh under the protection of 8 modern destroyers. The operation was commanded by the experienced Admiral Masatomi Kimura, who had already had a blast at Guadalcanal. At the heart of this desperate charge was an outdated doctrine, Kantai Kessen, or decisive battle. The Japanese admirals, brought up on the labors of Admiral Togo, still believed that the war could be won in one grand naval battle, where the battleships of the fleet would crush the enemy. They underestimated the new reality. Under the domination of enemy aircraft, especially its base aircraft, the sea was no longer a safe space. Their faith in speed, courage, and old dogmas became their Achilles' heel. Part 2. Armorers of Retribution. On the other side of the front, at the Allied headquarters in Port Moresby, the atmosphere was different. General Douglas MacArthur, whose famous "I'll be back" oath was in the air, demanded decisive action from his troops. His air commander was the man ideally suited for the task, Lieutenant General George C. Kenney. He found the 5th Air Army in a state of decline. The pilots were demoralized, the tactics were outdated, and the results were negligible. Precision bombing from high altitudes, the sacred cow of pre-war doctrine, against maneuverable naval targets proved to be a failure. Less than 1% of the bombs reached their target. Kenney, a pragmatist and an innovator, dropped the charters. He gave the green light to experiments, and there was a man under his command whose technical genius was fueled by personal revenge. That man was Major Paul Daddy Gunn. A former naval aviator, a mechanic from God, he knew every screw in the plane. His personal tragedy, his wife and children remained in the Japanese-occupied Philippines, turned him into a gunsmith driven by rage. For Gunn, this war was not abstract, but deeply personal. It was he who took on the modest B-25 Mitchell medium bomber. Gunn threw the traditional approach overboard. He physically cut out the nose of the plane, removing the bombardier's seat with his precision Norden. In its place, he installed a real battery of death. 8 Browning M2 heavy machine guns firing forward. Now the Mitchell could unleash a barrage of almost 7,000 bullets per minute, sweeping away anti-aircraft crews and ship decks even before bombs were dropped. But the main thing was not machine guns, but new tactics. Kenny and Gunn have revived a forgotten technique: skip bombing, or ricochet bombing. The planes were not supposed to bomb from a safe height, but to dive to the level of the masts, almost touching the waves, and drop bombs with a delayed fuse at a distance of only 200 to 300 feet from the target. The bomb, hitting the water, ricocheted several times like a flat stone and crashed into the side of the ship right at the waterline, its most vulnerable point. While Gunn was turning the B-25 into a flying battleship, the Australians offered their own recipe for destruction. The Bristol Beaufighter heavy attack fighter, nicknamed the Flying Toilet Bowl for its shape, was a real monster. The 4 20mm Hispano cannons in its nose could pierce through the light armor of destroyers. Their task was to go first, suppressing air defenses and wreaking havoc, clearing the way for the Mitchells. Intensive training began in Port Moresby. The pilots of the 90th Bomber Squadron spent days and nights practicing low-altitude approaches, using the old wreck in the harbor as a target. They learned not to aim, but to feel. The risk was enormous. One wrong maneuver and the plane could crash into the mast or be shot down by its own bomb. But they persevered, turning from ordinary bomber crews into elite ship hunters. Part 3. The hunt begins. While the Allies were honing their deadly blade, the Japanese convoy set sail. On the night of March 1, 1943, under cover of an impending storm, 8 transports and 8 destroyers of Admiral Kimura left Rabaul. The hope was that the bad weather would hide them from aerial reconnaissance. The first day passed relatively calmly, but on the morning of March 2nd, the weather began to clear up, and the convoy was detected by the PBY Catalina flying boat. The shadow of the pursuer fell on the Japanese ships. Admiral Kimura understood that he had been discovered, but there was nowhere to retreat to. The first attack followed on the same day. The high-level B-17 flying fortresses carried out an inaccurate but demoralizing strike. One of the transports, the Kyokusei Maru, was hit and began to sink. Admiral Kimura, acting according to protocol, ordered the destroyers to remove his men. This was a fatal mistake. Now the destroyers, already overcrowded, were packed with rescued soldiers, which limited their maneuverability and combat capability. The night from March 2nd to March 3rd became a time of painful waiting for the Japanese. The soldiers, huddled on the open decks of the destroyers, wet from the salt spray, peered into the darkness, listening to the distant but relentless hum of the Catalan, which, like ghosts, continued to illuminate the convoy and transmit its coordinates. The noose was tightening. Every mile that brought them closer to Leh led them into the thick of the trap. Part 4. The Day of the Massacre. The morning of March the 3rd greeted the convoy with a ruthlessly clear sky and calm sea. Perfect conditions for murder. Admiral Kimura ordered the ships to close in as tight a formation as possible. The anti-aircraft gunners took up their posts, peering into the dazzling blue. And then they heard it. At first, there was a low rumble, which quickly turned into a deafening roar. At low altitude, the Australian Beaufighters appeared, barely missing the crests of the waves. For the Japanese, accustomed to attacks from heights, it was a shocking sight. The flying toilets hit them like a hurricane. 4 20mm cannons in the nose of each plane spewed death. The shells tore through steel, swept away anti-aircraft crews, and detonated ammunition. The decks turned into a slaughterhouse. While the Japanese sailors and soldiers were recovering from this shock, Paul Gunn's Mitchells went on the attack. Flying at an altitude of 30 to 50 feet, they looked like low-flying birds of prey. Their noses, spewing fire from 8 barrels, blinded and destroyed everything in their path. Machine gun bursts pierced the destroyer's superstructures, mowing down the command staff. Admiral Kimura himself was fatally wounded on the bridge of the flagship destroyer Shirayuki. Bombs followed the fiery rampart. Dropped from a scanty height, they jumped on the water like smooth stones and bit into the sides of ships. Deafening explosions were heard. The steel sheets of the hulls rose up. The ships began to list and sink. The chaos was absolute. The Tai Maru transport, packed with soldiers, was hit in the hold. Hundreds of people were trapped and drowned in a matter of minutes. The destroyer Orazio tried to counterattack but was torn in half by a direct hit. The Yukikaze destroyer, the hero of many battles, desperately maneuvered, trying to cover the transports and save the drowning, but was powerless against a flock of aerial predators. By noon, the Bismarck Sea presented an apocalyptic picture. Black columns of smoke from burning and sinking ships rested against the sky. The water was covered with iridescent streaks of fuel oil, debris. Bodies and people desperately clinging to life were floating everywhere. All 8 transports and 4 of the 8 destroyers were sunk or heavily damaged. The Allied victory was total. But the battle wasn't over. Part 5. The Order That Could Not Be Given. For the thousands of Japanese soldiers and sailors trapped in the water, the nightmare was just beginning. They clung to life rafts, debris, and empty fuel barrels, trying to escape into the blood-red water. It was at this moment that the very order arrived that will forever leave a shadow on this brilliant victory. General Kenny, the man who gave it away, later claimed it was a harsh military necessity. In his memoirs, he quoted an order given by his deputy, General Ennis Whitehead: "The lifeboats and rafts must be destroyed. It is not possible to catch the survivors and capture them." Kenny himself allegedly stated, "I want every fucking Japanese in the water to be killed. I don't want any of them to reach the shore." For the pilots, this order became a moral dilemma. Some, hardened by the war and aware of the atrocities of the Japanese, carried it out without hesitation. For them, these were not defenseless people, but enemy soldiers who, having reached the shore, would take up arms again. Others were disgusted. Shooting at unarmed people in the water was contrary to everything they had been taught. But an order is an order. The Beaufighters and the Mitchells are back. They descended to a low-level flight and methodically, with cold brutality, shot life rafts and crowds of people in the water. 20 mm shells tore wooden boats to splinters. Machine gun bursts pierced the water, leaving bloody trails in their wake. In the reports, the pilots wrote dryly, "The personnel in the water was disabled," a bureaucratic euphemism hiding the horror. The massacre lasted for 3 days. At night, American PT torpedo boats joined the hunt, which finished off the survivors in the dark. Japanese submarines managed to save only a few hundred people. Of the initial 6,900 soldiers, fewer than 1,200 reached Leh, and they were in a state of shock, without weapons or equipment. Part 6. Echoes in History. The tactical triumph of the Allies in the Battle of the Bismarck Sea was absolute. Japan suffered a crushing defeat, from which it never recovered in the campaign in New Guinea. The strategy of sending reinforcements in large convoys was buried forever. From that moment on, supplies were supplied only by air, by submarines, or on small barges, which only delayed the inevitable. The tactics of skip bombing and low-altitude assault attacks were fully justified. Daddy Gun and George Kenny became heroes. Their innovations changed naval aviation forever, proving that airplanes can be effective ship killers. However, the moral legacy of the battle turned out to be much more complex. The destruction of the survivors in the water became a dark secret that many participants preferred not to remember. This story did not fit into the image of the greatest generation who fought for a just cause. The events in the Bismarck Sea were not the only such incident in that war. Similar things happened on the other side. However, it was precisely such episodes that made the world community think about the limits of what was allowed in the war. In 1949, just 4 years after the end of the war, the new Geneva Conventions were adopted. The second of them, on improving the lot of the wounded, sick, and shipwrecked members of the armed forces at sea, explicitly prohibited the finishing off of shipwrecked people. It is safe to say that the horror experienced by Japanese soldiers in the Bismarck Sea was one of the bitter lessons that formed the basis of this document. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea remains in history as a stark reminder, a harsh reminder of the dual nature of war. This is a story about a brilliant military victory achieved through wit, bravery, and technological superiority, and at the same time, it is an eternal warning about how easy it is, even in the name of necessity, to cross the line of humanity, leaving behind not only a triumph, but also an unhealing moral wound. It is this ambivalence that perhaps makes her remain in the shadow of history to this day. Part 7. The Price of Triumph and the Wound on Conscience. Official Allied reports trumpeted the triumph. The newspaper headlines screamed, "Japanese convoy destroyed. MacArthur's greatest victory." Militarily, it was a flawless operation. Allied losses totaled only 13 aircraft and 44 men, while Japan lost more than 3,000 soldiers and sailors, dozens of cover planes, and tons of vital supplies. It was a great moment for General Kenny, who proved the effectiveness of his command and his tactical innovations. But in the silence of the aircraft cabins and in the barracks on the shore, there was a different atmosphere. A quiet but noticeable rift began among the pilots who returned from the sweep. Lieutenant Robert Cromlin, a B-25 pilot, later recalled, "We saw their faces. They were not the faceless enemies of the propaganda videos. They were scared young guys trying to survive. When you see your bullets kicking up water around them and then you see them disappear, it stays with you forever. We told ourselves that anyone who survived would be killing our guys tomorrow, but that night, dinner was a lump in my throat." Some crews, however, did not feel any remorse. Gunnery Sergeant Jack Delaconica spoke bluntly. "They started this war. They staged a massacre in Nanjing, bombed Pearl Harbor while sleeping. They did not take prisoners of our pilots. For me, it was just another combat mission. Destroy the enemy." This split reflected a broader moral conflict that permeated the entire Pacific War, a war that was fought on both sides with particular bitterness and racial hatred. The order to take no prisoners or leave no witnesses was not an official Allied doctrine, but it was sometimes carried out at the level of small units. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea brought this grim practice to an operational level sanctioned by the High Command. Part 8. The Japanese Perspective. The Sinking Ship of Hope. To fully understand the scale of the tragedy, it is necessary to look at it from the other side. For Japan, the convoy to Leh was not just a logistical operation. After the debilitating defeat on Guadalcanal, it was an attempt to restore prestige and strategic initiative. The 51st Division was considered one of the best. The diaries of several surviving Japanese soldiers, miraculously delivered by submarines to Rabaul, paint a heartbreaking picture. A soldier named Ichiro Tanaka wrote, "When the first plane flew so low that I saw the pilot's face, our transport was already on fire. The water around them was boiling from the explosions. We jumped overboard, but the sea was no better. It was burning with oil. We were swimming to the life raft, and then the fire came down from the sky again. The people around me screamed and then fell silent, turning the water red. I dived as deep as I could and heard bullets piercing the water above my head. I thought I was in the hell the monks told us about." For the Japanese command, the defeat was a shock comparable to Midway. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, fell into gloomy silence after receiving the report. he was aware of the consequences. Without the ability to reinforce the garrisons by sea, the Japanese positions in New Guinea were doomed. It was a strategic dead end. The news of the massacre of the survivors was hidden from the general public, but it generated both horror and bitterness at headquarters. This became another argument in favor of the death to the last soldier tactic, because now the Japanese soldiers knew that there would be no mercy. Part 9. Direct Legacy. How Bismarck Changed the War. The immediate consequences of the battle were swift and irreversible. The end of the Tokyo Express. Japan has completely abandoned the idea of large convoys in the Allied air zone. All subsequent supply attempts were carried out at night, on high-speed destroyers, or with the help of stealthy submarines and small self-propelled barges, which was a drop in the bucket for the needs of huge garrisons. Famine as a weapon. The garrisons in Leh and Salamaua, and then along the entire coast of New Guinea, were doomed to slow extinction. Without food, medicine, and ammunition, Japanese soldiers fell victim to disease and starvation. The Allied victory was now achieved not only with the bayonet, but also with the blockade. Tactical benchmark. The success of skip bombing and low-altitude attacks has made them the standard tactics of the USAF throughout the Pacific Theater. Subsequent battles, such as the Battle of the Philippine Sea and Leyte Gulf, proved that the era of battleships as the main force at sea was irretrievably gone, giving way to aircraft carriers and base aircraft. Technological race. The success of the Beaufighters and modified B-25s has spurred the development of specialized attack aircraft capable of withstanding massive damage and carrying even more powerful weapons. A direct descendant of this philosophy can be considered aircraft like the A-10 Thunderbolt Descendant, whose main task is to destroy ground targets with the help of a powerful cannon installation. Part 10. The Impenetrable Shadow. Why was this battle forgotten? Why didn't such a landmark victory become a textbook example of the Normandy landings or the Battle of Stalingrad? The answer lies in its dual nature. The inconvenient truth is that heroic narratives prefer to avoid episodes involving the killing of unarmed people. After the war, in the era of the Cold War and moral confrontation with totalitarian regimes, it was unprofitable for the West to highlight cases that could be used by Soviet propaganda to expose imperialist atrocities. Focus on Europe. Public attention and historiography have long been focused on the European theater of operations. The war against Nazism was perceived as more pure and ideologically clear. The complex, brutal, and racially tinged Pacific War required a more nuanced approach. The guilt of the participants. Many veterans of the 5th Air Army preferred not to recall the final act of the battle. Their personal archives and memoirs were often silent about these episodes, focusing on the masterful execution of the naval attack itself. This collective tacit agreement also contributed to the oblivion of the full picture. Conclusion. Triumph and warning. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea remains more than just a page of military history. This is an eternal lesson. She reminds us that in war, the line between military necessity and a war crime can be dangerously thin. She demonstrates how desperation and personal revenge can become the engine of a technological breakthrough. And it shows how easy it is to dehumanize an opponent in order to justify the unjustified. This is the story of how the brilliant mind of Daddy Gun and Kenny's strategic vision saved thousands of Allied lives by shortening the war. But it is also the story of how the same genius and determination doomed thousands of young people to painful deaths, who, ironically, like their opponents, were just cogs in the monstrous machine of war. It is hidden in the shadows not because it is shameful, but because it forces us to look into the dark mirror of history and ask ourselves uncomfortable questions about the price of victory and the nature of man in war. And as long as these questions remain unanswered, the echo of machine gun fire over the blood-red waters of the Bismarck Sea will resound through the decades as a stern warning for future generations.